Hello everybody, this is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to episode 7. We're going to do something a little bit different this week. I'm going to talk you through some of the recent Dota 2 roster shuffle changes, as well as some of the changes that I think need to be made to the roster and the majors system, ideally even before TI6. So the asterisk this week is even bigger than usual in full glorious 322 point font, but let's get right into it. So we're going to start with the Great Western Shuffle. This is really a shakeup at the very, very top of professional Dota 2. First of all, I know that you guys are already following Wick on Reddit, but if you're not, please do. He's responsible for most of the graphics that I'm using to describe the teams in this set of slides. They really are wonderful, and I want to give him a lot of credit for that. They are used with his permission here. So obviously the move that everybody's been talking about that had everybody excited was Arteezy and Universe unexpectedly leaving Evil Geniuses to return to Team Secret. Of course, I had an article up on ESPN about that a couple of days ago. It was a very unexpected move, and it kind of led to this cascading a series of roster changes throughout the Western scene. The immediate response to that, of course, was that EG was left with their 2 roster holes to fill. They ended up filling them with Bulba and AUI coming over from Digital Chaos. Misery and We would eventually move to a team that would become the new Digital Chaos. And so when all the dust had settled, here's what the rosters looked like. Each of these teams, EG and Secret, changed 2 players from their old rosters. So we still do have Envy, Puppy, and Pile Die on Secret, with the addition of Arteezy and Universe coming over from EG. EG is now going to be Sumail, Fear, and PPD as before, with the addition of AUI, who won TI with them, of course, last year, and Bulba coming over at the off-lane position from DC. I know a lot of the questions early on had centered on who was going to play carry. The current plan for the team is going to be to move AUI back to that carry position that he played earlier in his career with Team Dignitas. Remember, AUI was one of the best Tinies, one of the best Naga Sirens in the world before that change over to the support position. So I think he's going to look fine. I actually think that this change gives them a lot of strategic options going forward. I would not be surprised to see them experiment with Fear back at carry as well. But guys, what a lot of people don't appreciate, Fear actually had one of the best KDAs at the Shanghai Major on that 4-position support. I think he was probably the best player on EG in Shanghai with that roster, so I think it makes sense for them to keep him at the 4-position at now. Obviously, the big question for EG is going to center around Bulba. Universe, we just talked about Fear's KDA. Universe had the best kills plus assists over death ratio in Shanghai of any player from the offlane position. That is unheard of for an offlaner. He was obviously, I was critical of some of his plays during that event, but he is obviously arguably the top player and certainly in the top 5 players in the world right now. On paper, that's an upgrade for Secret. I am actually very optimistic about this new EG roster, though. I think in many ways, we're going to get into this in some future videos as we look at the picture going into Manila, but in many ways, I think this EG roster actually looks a lot more like what they ran what they won TI5 with last year, and that's not just because AUI is back. I think, remember last year at TI5, Bulba was their coach. He's been a very solid offlaner for Digital Chaos, even though that team hasn't found the success that we all expected. I think this new EG roster is going to be fine. Digital Chaos, on the other hand, I actually think may have won in a way, just because I think there are now 3 Western superpower teams rather than just 2. I think we and Misery give this team a very, very strong foundation. Resolution is a mid laner that a lot of us have believed for a very long time had serious breakout major potential. Moo is somebody that a number of people, including Swindles, have been talking to me about recently as potentially being the next great captain coming out of North American Dota. And Saxia looked very, very good recently with Mama's Boys, an 8.5k support player out of Europe. I think this team has serious serious potential to be a contender. Obviously, they don't have the kind of pedigree. You're not going to be as confident predicting them having success going forward as you would be with EG and Secret, but I definitely think that this new DC roster has serious superstar potential. Now, I think the big questions, though, coming out about all of this really center around the players that were displaced. When you look at 1437, the old DC pretty much disbanded. He rejoined Secret as a coach, where I expect that he's going to have a lot of success. But again, when you talk about people's playing careers being either ended or temporarily suspended in these kinds of last-minute roster changes, keep in mind all of this happened with 3 or 4 days to go during the deadline. I think there's real cause for concern. Yawar, who rumor had it had actually been out of Digital Cast for some time, is left teamless. Pycat is, to my knowledge, teamless in this current season of rosters. So what you're talking about here, Fluff and Whitebeard leaving Archon for Fire, something that may have happened anyway. But when you're talking about situations where major championship players are left scrambling to find teams 3 or 4 days before the roster deadline, I do think that this is something going forward that needs to change in the scene. As far as how things fall out this time around, I actually think only a few players are really going to end up being severely hurt by this, but there are some serious concerns. I actually think that this could have turned out a lot uglier than it did. One thing to ask yourself, for example, is how much of this move going over to Digital Chaos was actually influenced by EWolves being banned by Valve for, due to match fixing scandals at the very last minute. Moo actually had an Archon roster reportedly ready to go with ztok, who was one of the players from EWolves that was affected by this match fixing ban. So even though I think really everything is going to be fine in the end for the players that are listed on this page, I am very, very concerned by how this happened. I think a lot of this could have turned out much, much more badly, both for these players and for the scene as a whole. That's something that we'll come back to a little bit later on in this video. Standing pat. I wanted to make sure and mention this because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about teams that have made roster changes. Turns out, not surprisingly, 6 out of the top 8 finishers from the Shanghai Major are going to go into this next season with identical rosters. Liquid, OG, and Alliance, Complexity, MVP Phoenix, and Fnatic are all going to be going in looking very, very good, possibly for direct invites to Manila, at least for invites to the regional qualifiers. I think that at least 4 out of the 6 teams on this slide you're going to see on that list for direct invites going into Manila. It is worth noting, again, we've talked about in the past that the directly invited teams in Shanghai really did struggle, and only 2 of the 8 directly invited teams from Shanghai are going to go into the next season keeping their same roster, that being OG and Alliance. So there really has been a lot of upheaval on the whole. Speaking of upheaval, let's try and navigate through the morass that is going to be Chinese Dota going into this next season. This was a little bit less chaotic in some sense because most of these changes were made a little bit farther in advance of the deadline, but still the roster swaps are kind of dizzying and really to be expected from a region that had the kind of struggles that we talked about in Shanghai in the previous video, going only 2-11 against series against international competition. You do expect to see some upheaval, but even so. So eHome we'll start with. eHome is going to add Ice and Fenrir from the old Vici Gaming squad. They send CTY over to Vici Gaming, and they send their 4-position player Kaka over to the new Newbee roster. So they're going to be left, similarly to EG and Secret, they're going to be left with 3 players coming back from their previous season's roster, adding Ice, and Fenrir. Lanham is going to transition back to the carry position, which, similar to AUI, he had played earlier in his career. People don't forget he had a 768 CS game as Tiny back, I believe that was at TI2, with an old Chinese squad. So I think they're going to be fine, but there are certainly a lot of question marks around this team as they go forward. Vici Gaming, though, I think of the big Chinese squads, Vici is probably the organization that faces the most uncertainty in terms of both what their rosters look like and how these rosters are going to perform. Burning is actually the only player that is staying on the first team Vici Gaming squad. This is a real concern going forward. CTY, obviously, huge potential, going to be transitioning back to that mid lane role that he played so well at TI5 from the carry position. He certainly had a lot of success as carry with eHome, but retaining Burning as a part of that Vici Gaming squad, they're going to move CTY back to mid. ROTK had struggled a little bit with LGD as captain, but they're going to let him play that role with the Vici Gaming squad again as an offlane player. His hero pool had looked a little bit bigger in recent weeks, but that's going to be a concern going forward, as well as whether these players are going to gel under his leadership. At times, it certainly looked like last season's LGE were chafing a little bit under the leadership of ROTK. In a very surprising move, FY is actually going to join Vici's kind of second team, Vici Gaming Reborn, they're calling this squad. This is a squad that's actually looking pretty darn good in the early going. They've already had some decent results here in competition. They look like they might qualify for a couple of lands. I'm really excited to see FY in kind of really the captain's chair again, leading this squad into new international land competitions. The squad's also going to be anchored by DDC, a veteran support player that's been around in the Chinese scene for a very long time. He played with eHome at TI5, so this is another thing I'm doing on this slide. When players are coming from an older squad, I'm going to add the team icon from TI5 at the lower right, so you can see that here with DDC. ZYF is a player that's been talked about for a very long time as just a phenomenal potential talent. He's going to be at the carry position for this new squad. I'm a little bit skeptical about this, but certainly if you can unlock that potential in ZYF, this is a squad that could be very, very good, perhaps even better in terms of their ceiling than Vici Gaming's first team. CDEC, also a lot of upheaval here. They're going to send XZ to their youth squad. They're sending Aggressive over to LGD, so that famous carry position play is going to change a little bit for them. They're going to fill out their roster with Rabbit, who played with Newbee at TI5, and Yao, who played offlane for LGD. Yao's actually been statistically a very strong offlaner in the past. Super, coming over from Vici Gaming, is a player that there's a lot of uncertainty around right now. A lot of analysts that I've heard, including myself, have been very, very critical of his play over the last 6 months or so. I have very much liked his play style in the past. I've referred to him in the past as kind of the Fata of the East. He's a very team-oriented mid player. I think that his play style could work very, very well with what CDEC had been doing in the previous patch. But again, sending Aggressive over to LGD, you really ask whether that same play style is still going to suit them quite as well. LGD, I think, actually may be the most promising of the Chinese rosters coming into this new season. That's not just because of the return of Zhao. I think Aggressive brings with him a real breath of fresh air into the squad. MMY, I think, has been one of the best, if not the best, 5-position players in the game for a very long time. He's the career leader in Pro Dota 2 LAN wins, remarkably consistent at the support position. But I really think LGD needed kind of some reinvigoration, a little bit of fresher play style to really wake that potential back up for maybe. I thought in TI5 that he was the second best player in the tournament behind only Sumail, did some amazing things at the mid position, but it really looked to me over the last few months that his play style had stagnated a bit. I think Aggressive really brings a new style to the table, and under Zhao 8's leadership, I look for this squad to make some real noise. And of course, Newbee, sending Zhao Tulei and Lei are two players that had played with them in the previous season. I don't really know what's going on with them. I hadn't found their names anywhere on one of the new rosters. If you know anything about this, please let me know on Twitter or in the comments below. But they are adding Kaka from eHome, as well as bringing in KP over from the old MVP Phoenix at TI5. This is a squad that I actually think looks very, very promising. When you talk about the Chinese squads going forward, you really have to break it out into two scenarios and ask yourself, how much do you think Shanghai was really a blip on the radar? Because if you think that Shanghai was kind of a temporary low hit because of a lot of factors, including coming directly off the Chinese New Year, then I think you look at eHome, LGD, and maybe even this Newbee squad as being very legitimate contenders going forward, maybe even among that top 7 or 8 teams in the world. If you believe that Shanghai was really much more indicative of some lasting issues that are going to continue to affect these teams, then I think there's a lot more uncertainty. You still look at LGD as a squad with some very high upside, but there I think you have to really downweight a lot of these teams and take the kind of I'll believe it when I see it attitude. I would lean more toward the former. I think that these LGD, Newbee, and eHome rosters could be very, very strong in the coming season. But again, I think that's you could easily make a video about that in and of itself. So CIS, this was a real chaotic situation. I'm not even going to try to give you sort of the full arrow chart with this one. Suffice to say, Team Spirit is going to keep their core. They're going to keep Iceberg. They're going to keep Goblak at captain. They're going to keep Always Want to Fly. They send Ramses, their former very young carry position player, and Afterlife over to the new Team Empire squad, which is really completely blown up from the previous season. And they're going to add Funnick and Illidan to round out that 5-man roster. I think that this Team Spirit squad really still has a lot of potential. Iceberg is still on my list of most promising young players in the game, and I think it's just going to be a matter of whether or not they can bring some of that veteran presence to stabilize some of their gameplay. Empire is probably one of the more surprising, if not the most surprising team of all going into this next season. That roster is completely blown up. They're bringing back Scandal, who is one of my favorite players from a very long time ago. I literally still will occasionally watch some of his old replays on Invoker. I learned Invoker by watching that guy play. He is an amazing player, but we haven't seen him compete at the highest levels of Pro Dota for quite some time. I'm very skeptical of this new Empire roster, but I'm really excited about seeing him back. Empire are going to send the 2 players that I thought they were trying to build around over to Virtus Pro's main squad to join God and FNG, also bringing in No Fear at the 4 position. This was another really, really big surprise that Virtus Pro, you know, they had looked so promising for such a long time, but really did look like they had some serious chemistry issues in the previous season. In partial response to that, they've chosen to send Lil and DK Phobos over to sort of their second team, VP Polarity, along with Pasha from the old Vegas squadron. They're going to add Alpha Ninja from Hellraisers, and relatively unknown players, No Fear and Genya, are going to round out at the support positions of these 2 squads. You know, I call Polar kind of their second team, but remember the last iteration of VP over the previous year and a half saw VP Polar become really better than the main VP squad at the time and go on to become one of the top teams in the world. I really believe that either of these VP squads could be very, very good going forward. But again, the concern is always these personal issues. I think that we've really had some frictions among these teams that have been holding some of them back over the past few months. Vegas Squadron is probably the most stable of the CIS teams. They're going to bring in FN at the carry position. Other than that, their roster is virtually unchanged. They're still going to have Mag and Solo, those veteran presences at the 3 and 4 position roles. And you know what? Mid obviously gets a lot of press. We talk a lot about the stats in the carry position, but I tweeted this the other day. I really believe that right now, with the game as it is, that in terms of gameplay, your 3 and your 4 position and your captain are what win you majors. So I really still am pretty optimistic about Vegas Squadron as long as Mag and Solo can continue to play at that high level. In terms of the rest of the CIS teams, Na'Vi has been competing with this roster for a little while now. General's relatively new, but they're going to keep on Dityara, Dendi, Seneko, and Artstyle. And again, I still think that this Na'Vi squad could be very, very good. They just haven't shown it to me just yet. I really haven't seen the kind of chemistry out of them, the kind of consistency that you need to compete as a tier 1 team. So, as much as I'm hoping Na'Vi is back, I can't tell you that quite yet. Fantastic Five is a squad that sort of formed out of the remnants of a lot of other teams. Could be very, very good. Looked pretty good in the first official match that I saw them play today. RMN had like a 15-minute blink dagger on Lion, so the potential is certainly there. But again, we're looking for consistency. And this new Power Rangers squad should be very interesting. You're going to see Big Num transition back to the carry position. You'll get to see Arise mid, presumably on his signature Magnus. J4 has been an excellent 5-position support for a long time, and don't count out Cheshire Cat in that off-lane role that I just said was so important. But again, I can't really look at any of these CIS squads and say this is the 1 or 2 that are going to come out of this region. This region, really, despite us talking so much about China in terms of their performance at Shanghai, CIS is the region that I think that has the most questions to ask going forward. Still a lot of talented players, a lot of potential on these rosters, but really not clear which teams are going to emerge. So in terms of the rest of the field, we'll look at Mineski, Orange Tearing. So Orange Esports, a name that we all should remember from previous TIs, is going to get back into sponsoring SEE Dota jointly with this Tearing squad featuring Yamate at the carry position. White Fries Gaming, which this is not their actual logo, this is just something I found that I thought was funny, is going to come back with HY and ZSMJ, 2 of the greatest names in Asian Dota for quite some time. Really am optimistic about what you're going to see out of them. And of course, my new fan favorite squad, who I'm going to be rooting for in the qualifiers, is the newly formed Kai-P roster. Featuring Mad back at that support position with Come With Me, Bone 7 at the off lane, and of course Sing Sing at that carry with Cancel as your mid player. Plays a very strong invoker as well as a couple other meta heroes. So I think they could be pretty good. Okay, so I wanted to take at least a couple minutes at the end of the video to talk about the system and what I think needs to change, because really I look at a couple of things, all right? The current system is just, it's not transparent. People don't know what's going on. And I think anytime you have major champion players dropped with 3 or 4 days remaining before the roster locks, I think you have the potential for disaster. I didn't even get around to mentioning on the previous slide, for example, Vanscore was another player that could really have been adversely affected. You had this Avengers squad that formed kind of at the last minute. They supposedly kicked Vanscore after he had already declined an offer from Empire. He was very nearly left teamless, and now, as far as I understand the situation, this Avengers squad aren't going to be competing at all. This is the kind of thing that I think you need to avoid, and part of the way to avoid this, I think, is to try and stop these situations where you have 2 players moving unexpectedly, creating this trickle-down effect that potentially impacts dozens of other players and teams. So a number of people, this was credited to Reddit. There was a big thread that I thought had some really good takes on this issue, but this is something that I've talked about with other people in the scene going back over a period of months, even well before Shanghai. The idea of a 2-phase roster lock system. So you have a drop lock date for players already on lost rosters, followed by a later add lock date 1 to 2 weeks later. that's coincident with the current roster lock date in terms of its timing. I think that this is a fine idea. The big problem that I have with it, and a point that I really haven't heard other people making about it, is that I don't think this by itself fixes the problem. Forgive the geeky economist analogy, but I really do think that this is like healthcare insurance reform going along with tort reform. You just can't make meaningful progress on the one without the other. To me, in order to fix the system, in order to bring the kind of stability that we all hoped the majors and the roster lock system was going to bring to the scene, you have to clarify the major selection process. The first thing that I ask when you say, okay, you have this drop lock date is, well, to which teams does this drop lock date apply? You cannot apply a drop lock date to all people that were on rosters from the previous season, because most of those teams, most of those registered rosters from the previous major season will have already disbanded by the time the major ends. The teams that fail to make it through the qualifiers probably aren't even together anymore. So the drop lock deadline for those teams doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I think in order to make the drop lock meaningful, you have to apply that to a limited set of teams, and that in order to do that in a sensible way, you have to clarify the major invite system. So just to give you an example, okay, the big problem, the criteria for major invites and even eligibility for consideration for those invites is currently really not clear. I mentioned in the previous video, this is compounded by the fact that the major and the qualifier dates are being announced only about 3 months out. And this is really where the Dota scene has a big point of divergence from, say, League of Legends, where in League, because you have the LCS system, the events in which various teams are playing are much more, I won't say restricted, but they're much more predefined. In Dota, you have individual teams and organizations completely responsible for setting their own schedules and figuring out which events you're going to compete in. In League, you have a much more scripted set of team participation criteria. And so what you get is teams are having to make decisions in Dota about which events to play, which tours to go on, with nearly zero information about their invite status and about how the field is going to look going into that next major. So I talked about this a little bit in the last video, but if you looked before the new StarLadder Invitational Tournament was announced, you had only 2 LAN events between Shanghai and the Manila Open qualifiers. One of those events, Dota Pit, which is already concluded, the qualifiers for that event took place well before Shanghai. So you're in a situation where you have a LAN finals that really is going to determine a lot about how the Manila invite picture looks, but teams like Alliance are completely shut out. I mean, right now, when you look at Alliance versus OG, if not for Alliance that we know is going to that StarLadder Invitational, Alliance could have been completely locked out of LAN events between the end of Shanghai and bids going out for Manila. And when you talk about, well, should Alliance or OG be invited, when really neither of those teams is going to have a meaningful LAN presence between the previous major and the time bids go out for the next, how do you even go about answering that question, right? So I think you've got to make things a lot clearer. The other thing that I think happens is it hurts the events a lot. The We Play LAN finals actually currently conflict with the Manila Open qualifiers. So you have a situation where both the profile of the event is being hurt because you know that the results of the We Play LAN finals are not going to impact the direct invites to Manila, and yet it's too far out to really have an impact going into TI6. You have certain teams, for example, Fnatic probably isn't the best example because by virtue of their top 6 finish in Shanghai, they're almost certain to at least get an invite to the SEA regional qualifiers. But go with me a little bit here. It's at least plausible that you could have a team like Fnatic, had they done a little worse in Shanghai, that could be having to choose whether to accept an invitation to a LAN that might conflict with open qualifiers that they would have to play in. And that's a really bad situation. It's something that hurts the scene, it hurts these individual teams, and it's something that I really do think we want to avoid at all costs. The other thing, this EWolves situation really does bother me a lot. there were a ton of players that were potentially hurt by this. Moo, I'm not sure if he would have ended up on Digital Chaos if not for ztok being rendered ineligible. But when you look at a system, yes, I think in the current iteration, the worst case was not realized and most of these players are going to be fine. But I think if you look at the trend over the last few major cycles, more and more of this chaos has been happening with just days to go until the roster deadline. I really do think if we go forward under the current system that the worst is yet to come. I mean, Gods tweeted out a couple of days ago that the TI6 Open qualifiers figured to be stacked because rosters don't open up again after Manila. You are going to have teams disband, and I really worry about what that's going to do. A lot of people have made the argument to me in the past that, well, it doesn't really matter because if you're a good team, you're going to get through open qualifiers anyway. Well, what happens when you have a bunch of, borderline tier 1 or very good tier 2 teams all disband? All of a sudden they're sitting in the open qualifiers. That argument really doesn't work when you get to that point. So I think, I've taken a while getting there, but my big thrust of this slide is going to be the first step in any solution is that I think the major invite process needs to be clear. Now, there's no one way to do this. I want to emphasize that because I think a lot of times what happens is somebody proposes a solution and everybody goes and picks it apart with a fine-tooth comb. I have not thought that long and hard about this. I want to present this slide as sort of a sketch of one possible solution, how it would work. Throw a few ideas out there. I fully expect that people are going to find some problems with this and hopefully people will improve upon it. But I do think that the ideas here are worth discussing. So you start with the idea that the top 3 to 4 teams from the previous major are guaranteed direct invites. This is similar to what they do in CSGO. In CSGO, I believe it's the top 8 teams from the previous major are guaranteed direct invites to the next. In Dota, I think you make it maybe the top 3 or 4, and you probably add in the restriction that there can be at most 1 or maybe 2 roster changes on those teams if they want to retain that guaranteed direct invite slot. I also think some people will take issue with this, but I actually also think that you probably add in the champion of the major before that. So OG, yes, they had their struggles in Shanghai. They did finish in the top half of the field, but they were tied with Alliance for 7th, 8th. I still think, though, that Frankfurt championship should mean something. They would probably be on my list of direct invites going into Manila, though I know a lot of people that I respect will differ with me on that point. So just for example, I think that set of criterion would leave us with Liquid, Secret, EG, and either or both of MVP, Phoenix, and OG as your sort of guaranteed direct invites going into the Manila invite process. In addition to that, one of the things that I've thought about is you might choose to release, Valve might choose to release a list of 4 to 8 additional protected teams. And the way this works is that these teams are guaranteed, number 1, at least a regional qualifier invite. So this is locked into that that they are going to be at least at the regional qualifier level, if not also direct invites. You may need to add, again, subject to at least 3 players remaining from the previous season's roster. I think that's reasonable. The other thing is at least with this idea, I've toyed around with the idea of having like a tiered seeded system or possibly even a GSL format for the regional qualifiers where these teams, these protected teams, if they do miss out on a direct invite, they come in sort of a little bit later in the regional qualifier process. But again, I'm not sold on that. I think that that's something that would need a lot of tweaking. Regardless, here's the important thing, okay? You end up with, in addition to the 4 or 5 teams that we listed in the first line, you end up with, again, MVP and or OG, Alliance, Fnatic, and probably even eHome, VG, and LGD as protected teams. These are teams that we are willing to commit, will at the very least be a part of the regional qualifiers, all right? And here's the key, that now you say the drop lock deadlines applies to these teams. You have a very small set of teams to which the drop lock deadline applies, but in my opinion, again, most of the real chaos in the roster shuffles comes from the top teams wanting to change things out with only a couple days to go, and it all sort of trickles down from there. I think if you take a relatively small set of tier 1 or protected teams, whatever you want to call them, and you say the drop lock deadline 1 to 2 weeks before applies to this set of teams, and then you have another deadline that's basically more or less the current system, I think you would limit a lot of the chaos that's occurring at the last minute, okay? And along the way, I think that clarifying the major invite criteria and the major invite process has a lot of other benefits for stability in the scene as well. I also feel, again, I'm not gonna harp on the EWolves issue too much because Swindles and I already kind of said our piece about that in a video the other day, but I really do think that these kinds of match fixing investigations or rules infractions investigations really do need to be handled in a much more transparent and public way. You know, I look at that situation and I say, EWolves have continued to play tournaments between the time that they were supposedly cleared by Valve immediately after these accusations were made publicly on Reddit. And for example, EWolves is already qualified for WePlay. Right? What does an event like WePlay do when they know EWolves has been disqualified from Valve major events, but it very well may be that legal considerations prevent them from also unilaterally disqualifying a team from their event without supporting evidence. So I just kind of think that creates a lot of real nightmares. The whole process, starting with the major invites, badly needs to be more transparent. Okay, I'm going to do a video in the next week or two with a little bit more of a detailed statistical breakdown of all these teams. For now, I just wanted to give you kind of the picture. Again, thanks to Wick for all these great graphics that made this video possible. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys get to spend some time with your families today. This is Nahaz, and I will talk to you all soon.